In this video, I'm going to show you how to use focus properly within your camera. I'm going to go over what focus is, a little bit about how it works, and then I'm going to walk you through a few settings within your camera so that you could use focus properly for specific situations. So let's start from the top. And you probably already know what focus is, but just in case, I want to give a little bit of a clarification. Focus is essentially the part of your image that is the most sharp and the most in focus. It is what you set up your camera to focus on with the lens. And most cameras actually have the focus button generally built into the shutter button. And the shutter button is the button you click to take the photo. So if you hold down the shutter button halfway, then this is generally when it's going to focus. And then when you click the shutter button full, that's when it's going to take the photo. They try to set it up this way so it's the most convenient and you don't have to hit any other buttons. However, we're going to do a little walk around this. You don't want this to be the situation because a lot of times you want to hit the shutter button, you don't want to hit it halfway. It's a little bit confusing. It's not always the perfect system, and we have a much better system in mind that you could use. So if you look on the back of your camera, and next to the viewfinder is generally where it's at, where you generally place your right thumb if you're holding the camera. There's usually a button called AF on. And what you're gonna do is you're gonna go through your camera's menus and you're gonna figure out how to set the AF on button as your focus button. So the focus button will no longer be on the shutter button of your camera. This way you can focus by just holding it with your thumb, and it's going to be the easiest and the fastest way to focus. It is called back button focus in some communities. Once this is set up, one more thing you can do to help enhance your focus game even more is you can look into focus peaking. So focus peaking is essentially a setting within your camera that will highlight everything in red in your viewfinder that is in focus. Generally, this is going to be more helpful if you're shooting with a manual lens so that you can see right exactly is in focus. But if you're just starting off, having everything highlighted in red can make it a little bit easier to determine if your shot's in focus or not. So those are the two main settings that I would set up if you're just getting into photography. So let's take a second to talk about how focus works. And obviously focus is connected directly with the aperture in your lens. So whatever you decide to set your depth of field to, as we talked about in the exposure video, that's how much the focus is going to pinpoint on a specific area versus a wider area. So just to quickly review, anything with a low aperture or a low f-stop number, such as f1.8, is going to have a much more shallow depth of field and provide a lot more blur in the background. The complete opposite with a higher f-stop number, say f16, is going to have much more of the image in focus. So with that being said, the two main types of systems built within cameras to focus are contrast detection and phase detection. If you are working with a mirrorless camera, it's going to have contrast detection. And essentially what this means is that within the camera, whenever you set focus on something, the camera determines the contrast points to determine what to focus on. So in more basic terms, contrast is essentially light pixels next to dark pixels. So with this knowledge in mind, you can help achieve focus in your camera by focusing on areas where there's heavier contrast. So for example, if you're out shooting and you just can't seem to get the camera to focus on something, try finding a point that has more contrast in it and you should be able to focus properly. On the other hand, phase detection systems are generally built into DSLR cameras. I'm not going to go too much into the science of it, but essentially it detects two different light rays within the scene and uses that to determine where focus is. So the main idea that I wanted to get across by introducing to you these two different types of focuses is what the benefits are of each one. So contrast detection focus is generally a little bit slower, however, it is much more accurate. So again, this is why I'd recommend a mirrorless camera over a DSLR. DSLR cameras, on the other hand, with their phase detection system, the focusing isn't nearly as accurate, however, it can be a little bit faster. So for tracking moving objects, it's generally better. But in the adventure photography world that we're exploring, we're not always going to be tracking faster objects. At least with me personally, I like to shoot stationary objects and a lot more landscape stuff. So it just makes sense to have a mirrorless camera. And at the end of the day, mirrorless camera technology is insane right now, and it's only getting better, and focus tracking is still phenomenal. There are countless professional bird and sport photographers that use mirrorless cameras entirely for their careers. So that's the two main systems of focus detection. So now let's move into the differences between auto versus manual focus. So autofocus, as it sounds, is made in newer camera models. I believe it was introduced sometimes in the 70s. And essentially this allows you to focus on a certain point and the camera and the lens will automatically focus on it for you. On the other hand, there is manual focus, and this is what all older cameras used to be, is you'd have to turn the ring on your lens in order to get the shot in focus. So luckily nowadays we have autofocus, which is much faster and more accurate. However, there are a few uses where you might find manual focus better. And for one of those situations, in really low light situations. So if you're shooting with auto and say you're at a concert or it's really dark outside, it can be hard to get your lens to focus on something. So one way you can mitigate this is by changing it over to manual focus, turn on focus peaking, and just determine where the highlights are red on your viewfinder, and it'll be much easier. Another good thing about manual focus is that it can be much more precise. So you'll notice with the focus areas, as we're gonna go through later in this video, there's only a tiny little general area that you can select the focus on. However, with manual focusing, you can get much more precision and much more precise to the exact point that you want to focus on. However, for most photography, this doesn't really matter, but in situations where you're shooting something like a macro scene where focus and depth of field are very relevant to the situation, then sometimes manual focus can be easier. So those are the main differences between auto and manual. Mainly shoot auto, but in low light or very specific situations, you might shoot manual. The next topic I wanted to cover is the different modes of focus within your camera. So there's a ton of different modes coming out nowadays, but I'm gonna go over some of the more popular ones that you're gonna see. So the most popular mode of focus is called singular focus. And this essentially means that if you hold the focus button down, it's gonna focus on a singular point and that's it. It's good to go. Until you focus it again, it's going to stay locked in that focus position. So singular focus is great for shooting a small scene, like landscape, for example, where there's not a lot moving around. The second mode of focus that you might encounter is called continuous focus. And this means that if you hold down the focus button and track a subject, it's going to stay locked on that and continue to focus. So as the subject moves closer or further from the camera or horizontal across the frame, as long as you're holding that button, it's going to stay in focus. And depending on the light, the camera model, and the quality of your lens is going to determine how well it stays in focus and tracks that item. So those are the first two, singular and continuous, probably the most popular ones that you're going to be using. Nowadays, there is a third focus mode that is starting to become more popular, which is called auto, not to be confused with autofocus. The auto mode will essentially distinguish between singular and continuous. So if you put this on, it's kind of like a hybrid between singular and continuous. So if you shoot a single scene, for example, and you're taking a landscape thing, boom, you get your shot, it's gonna stay in focus. However, if a bird suddenly flies across the frame, you pick up your camera, then you hold the button down, then you'll be able to switch into continuous without having to go into the menu. So it's a bit more of a hybrid mode that can be useful for some situations. The next focus mode I wanted to go over is the eye tracking. And this is usually in higher end cameras, but it's starting to become more prevalent across the entire scene. Is essentially a focus mode where you can lock on the eyes. The camera will automatically detect where the eyes are. So if you're shooting portraits or you're shooting something like ballet where the dancer is continuously moving, then it will keep their eye in focus, because as we all know with portrait shots, having the eyes in focus is the most important thing. And nowadays you can even find some cameras that are starting to reveal animal eye focus. So it will track the eye of the animal and follow it wherever it goes. The next part I wanted to go over is focus areas. So this is how you can program your camera to focus on certain parts of an image. So there's 5 main focus areas that I want to run through, and all cameras have different variations of these modes, and some might call them different things, but these are the most popular ones that you're going to see. So we'll start with wide. So wide focus area, if you set this up, it's essentially going to focus on anything within the scene that the camera seems to think is the topic of focus. So you're relying pretty heavily on the camera's opinion. Generally, it will focus on something moving. So if you're tracking a dog or something and you have wide focus on, it's most likely going to follow that dog as the subject. If you have a shot that's singular with a tree in it, it's probably going to figure out that that's probably the most important subject. However, it can change based off what you want. So if you're looking for more specific things to focus on instead of the very obvious subject, then I wouldn't use this mode. The next area is called the zone. And this is like wide, except it's a bit more specific. So this essentially means you could set a zone on your scene where you want it to focus. And again, the camera will make a decision based on what it thinks is the subject. So say you want something in the upper right corner of your image to be in focus, you can set that as a zone, and anything that's in that area, it will pick out. So it's kind of like wide, except it's a bit more specific to a certain area. The next focus area that you can set up is called spot. And this is the focus area that I use probably 95% of the time. Essentially, it creates a small little square on your viewfinder, and you could set that square to be anywhere, and that's where the focus will be. So you can be very specific about what you want it to focus on. And generally, you use the arrows on your camera. Sometimes there's a knob. Sometimes if your camera has a touchscreen LCD, you could touch a certain point and it'll set the focus there. So this is what I'd recommend using the most, especially for landscape photography. Anything that's moving, I wouldn't recommend using this because it's very difficult to track because it's only going to focus on that very specific area. But for most stationary subjects, you're going to be using spot focus. The next focus area that you can set up is center, which is fairly self-explanatory. It basically just keeps the very center of the screen focused no matter what's in that area. So if you're recording a video like this, for example, it's perfect because it's always going to maintain focus in the very center. The last focus area I wanted to go over is called tracking. And usually cameras have a bunch of variations of different tracking modes that you can set up, but essentially you use this in conjunction with the continuous shooting mode. So it essentially allows you to track subjects much easier, and if you really want to get into bird photography or animals or sports or ballet dancing or wrestling or whatever, you can start to look into this mode a bit more thoroughly. And that's everything I wanted to cover about focus. Pretty easy. Once you get that back button focus set up, then you're essentially ready to rock. You just got to make the decision between singular or continuous and what kind of scene you're going to be shooting. So you're going to be shooting a moving scene or a solitary scene. And that's how you choose spot focus or something like zone/wide. All right, let's go ahead and hop into the next video.